I am Professor Selina Busby from the Royal Central School of Speech and Drama, where I am the course leader for applied theatre. So I work with community groups in the UK and beyond, looking at how theatre can invite people to think about making a change of some sort.
Hello, my name's Andy Barrett. I run a community theatre company in Nottingham called Excavate. And we work with communities generally of place, but not always, across the region to dig into and find ways to share stories about culture, history, challenges, aspirations, and identity.
So my name is Antonia Liguori, and I'm a senior lecturer in applied storytelling. I'm part of the Storytelling Academy at Loughborough University, and my main expertise is in digital storytelling. And I've been working on a variety of projects globally, trying to co-design, expand the conventional model that we apply in workshops, the digital storytelling Californian model. And therefore, I'm here to learn from Selina and Andy how we can expand this model and make it work for the GenVir Network. So I think it's great we had an opportunity to spend some time together in Leicester a few weeks ago, and helped by Karen, we've been able to actually create this great visual representation of our thoughts, which probably we could use today as a guide to express what we believe could be a way of running the workshops in India. So Selina, would you like to start and kick off this?
I guess we really started to think about who we were making the workshops for, what they were about, and the really practical things of breaking it down into manageable sections. So as I watch it moving along, we ended the day coming up with roughly three workshops that could be delivered to various different groups within India. But getting there was a really roundabout discussion of how we all work and what we all felt was important about it. So it was a real combination of different disciplines and different ways of working. And I confess I'm not really sure where to start to unpick that. I'm not sure if linearly across the diagram is the best way to do it, or whether we should start with a specific theme and explore that. Antonia, what do you think? Where should we start?
I think even these challenges actually summarizing what we had to experience when we were even starting to think about this process. And I remember when Andy arrived, actually, there is this little guy that is creating a palette at the bottom left corner. Yeah. I think that was our first conversation, that actually one of the responses to those challenges were actually thinking about something that is adaptable.
Yeah.
And therefore we came with these 4 keywords of voices, opportunities, context, needs, and challenges. So probably we could start from
I was late, so I missed that discussion. When I arrived, the palette was already there. So
can I just add to that about the palette? I mean, I think what was interesting was when we started, we weren't exactly sure what would be most useful to the facilitators in India. So at that stage with the palette, it was about creating a kind of a range of suggestions and ideas and approaches that could be picked at random, if you like, depending on the context that the facilitator was working in. But after then speaking to the facilitator, I think that the palette, although it works, we kind of actually ended up saying, well, it will be helpful to devise a kind of a more specifically detailed process, which is what I think we did. Yeah. And it was very much about working with one group of people, knowing that those people will change, that we'll begin with one group, the second group will lose half the people, and the other half will bring some friends with them. And then hoping that by the third week, we'll have retained most of those people. And that it was fundamentally about finding ways for people to share their stories and to feel comfortable with each other. I think that was kind of the main focus of this.
Yeah, that's great. But it's also a great starting point for any discussion around how to co-design a workshop in a context in which probably we are not familiar with the kind of target audience. So I think the key questions we were asking ourselves before even talking with the local facilitators were quite relevant to them as well, because in theory, they could think about what they are trying to achieve and therefore adapt the model that we are suggesting here, depending on how things are going to change in the different locations. And I really like actually, you know, Andy, when we were talking about voice, you know, the voice of each individual, but then the plurality of those voices. And therefore, this is a sort of thread that we have maintained even when we were designing the process, because then we were thinking about how to make those voices heard, or how to make sense of silence, or, you know what I mean? It's like, even if the palette has been not the focus of the design of the 3 key workshops, but in a way, it stays there as a starting point. We can go back and actually be inspired by. And because I think that understanding the needs of these individuals who will be involved is always something like, is something to keep in mind across the 3 workshops, of course. And also another thing I really loved of the conversation we had when you arrived, Selina, was actually about how adaptable the process should be. And, you know, so if you want to say a bit more about that.
Yeah, it made me think about it again, actually, when you were just talking. It is the adaptableness or the flexibility of it. It is really important. I think a lot of what we've distilled sort of is 3 sets of workshops with some outlines of suggestions of what we might do in those situations. But the difficult thing for us to capture is what actually happens in the moment, and the exercises that we might do if we were delivering this type of workshop would really change depending on what was happening in the room. So it's a lot of the facilitation that I do, and I suspect that Andy does too, and actually Antonia as well, is that you react to what's happening in the room and you change your plan quite distinctly because of things that are moving. So I think that would be the one of the key things I'd want to say, is that the output, or the work, the output is a set of workshops, but that they're not set in stone at all. They're suggestions and guidelines of things that we think that work for us, that might work in this context, but the people on the ground, the facilitator delivering it, is the person who will know what it feels like in the room. So that adaptability for me is really fundamental. So although we've come up with like a toolkit maybe, or a box of tools to use, they're really, each of those is really flexible and adaptable, and you might want to throw them all out or bring in new things, and that's really okay. I guess that's the most important thing for me, is that that flexibility is fundamental to the way that we work, and it's really hard to capture that when you're trying to give somebody else a sense of how to work.
And just to add to that, all of these suggestions and all of these things that we would suddenly think, oh, let's try this, are ultimately just about trying to encourage and find ways for people to share their stories, to talk to each other, to talk to us, to feel safe in that, feel able to expand on whatever they're talking about. And that therefore it's not like the facilitation needs to feel as though it's having to mimic or copy or replicate or get drama exercises right.
Yeah.
Because they are the means to an end. And therefore, if in the facilitation, the facilitator felt uncertain about certain activities, rather than trying to replicate those, if they thought just having a cup of tea and talking would get more information, and they would feel more comfortable with that, that's fine. We're not, trying to say, here's some things that you must model in exactly the way that we think.
Yeah, absolutely. And I remember we also had quite lengthy and deep conversation to think about the space. I mean, you can see here this reversed face on our drawings, the space, the safe space, a closed space, and the integration. So if you want to say a bit more about what we define by space, is this a room, or is this, the kind of characteristics of interactions that we want to facilitate?
where to start with space. It's such a huge topic in applied theatre. So what you call it, how you use it, the safe space. It's a real ongoing dialogue in the discipline all of the time. I think some of the things that we said about space was that it needed to be. It didn't matter where the space was, but it needs to be safe in the sense that people are comfortable in it to share things. So the closed space is about not letting, or we talked about it being a woman only space if we want women to really talk to each other and share their stories. And so it's sort of closed in as much as people can't wander in and out of it or through it necessarily. And that specifically because it's such a short amount of time to be working with people, the long-term goal would obviously be to be combining gendered spaces, but in this instance to start off that it feels like it's more useful to start with women and explore the question that comes straight underneath that space diagram. Actually, what does it feel like to be a woman in India now? That if it's closed to women and in a space that's secure in some sense of the word, then we're more likely to get women genuinely sharing stories about what that feels like, and that seems to be fundamental to the whole process to me.
And one of the things that we may not have discussed, but thinking about this again, it's partly about what leaves that space.
Yeah.
And that's partly about the idea of the space as a kind of set of rules that are decided upon by the participants. You know, what remains in the room, so that people, because although other people aren't in the room, the knowledge, the stories can leak out.
Yeah.
So I think that's something to be aware of, you know, the kind of group feeling that they have constructed their own rules, if you like, of what happens with this material,
Yeah.
You know, because that will impact on potentially on what people are willing to say.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And actually, you were mentioning this question here, what does it feel like to be a woman in India, which was, for us, was actually something we came as a sort of final thought, even if it's here as a hook, as a key message to start with, because actually we had conversation also about how problematic the name of the project is to actually trigger conversation and create this safe space, so that gender violence is not, even if that is the name of the network, probably is not the right way in to start conversations. And actually this key question you just mentioned, what does it feel like to be a woman in India, is probably the best way for the local facilitators to start having those conversations. Would you agree?
I would completely agree with that. And I think what we said on the day when we were creating the workshops and the picture is that once you start with a question as open as what does it feel like to be a woman, the conversation will probably quite quickly lead to gender-based violence and resilience as a natural part of a conversation. I think if you start with it, you're more likely to silence people because it becomes a big issue. Whereas if you start with a more gentle approach, using some of the playful games that we'll talk about later, you actually get to quite deep stuff very quickly. And then you're also inviting people to share things that they feel comfortable sharing, and that they might not all want to leap straight into those difficult, deep conversations, but it still gives them a way into conversations and sharing, because it's a more, it's not really a neutral question, but it's a gentle question that could lead to interesting places.
And again, the other thing with that is there is the opportunity for that kind of shared knowledge and shared experience, which people find perhaps people feel more able to laugh at and enjoy the fact that other people feel like this, because maybe it's not as threatening, or it's at the very bottom end of a spectrum of power that ends up being very problematic. But in that moment, it allows the kind of laughter and the shared experience that helps to kind of bond the group, which is very important ultimately, for these kind of conversations.
Yeah,
Sorry, I was just going to say I completely agree that humour and joyfulness is actually how you get to the more difficult stuff. If you come in with the playfulness and the joy and the humour, then you're right, absolutely right, Andy. That the space feels, for want of a better word, safer, and stories and sharing will happen on a more on a deeper level than if you just start with a huge topic. I think you're absolutely right about humour. I think it's really important, and when we talk about our work, it's easy to leave that out because you don't feel it in the room when you're talking about it in this way. You're not in the room, which feels so joyful. And it's a really interesting conflict that the work feels so serious when you talk about it like this. When you're actually doing it, it's not serious a lot of the time. It's very playful and very joyful, and laughter is the biggest tool, most useful tool that you can use in a workshop like this, I would think.
Yeah, and this is the essence of, why we are using applied theatre and storytelling within this particular, research project, which I think is adding, this kind of aspect that if we were using like social sciences approaches, probably we were not able to actually achieve. So actually something more around the space is that we are trying to create a creative space, a space for creativity for everyone, where actually those sentiments, those feelings are freely expressed. And so there was something, so we said in the end, when we were somehow defining a structure for these 3 workshops, we said we hope to run 3 workshops in 2 locations, and ideally they should be consecutive or 1 per week. And we were thinking that each of those workshops should last 3 hours, actually 2 hours of activities with some time for, sharing food and sharing, informal conversations and having, again, a free space for them to connect. So how do you see the first week? I see here we say the first week actually is to get to know each other. So how do you see this first week actually to be, the starting point of these creative workshops?
I think you need to talk about that a little bit, Antonia, because the first one is the most traditional. I thought, I might be remembering this wrong, but we sort of talked about starting with some gentle games, but I think we talked about this as being your storytelling circle week. And so the heart of this one, there's some playful games and things before we get to that, but the heart of this one is more your territory than it is ours, I think. Well, Andy crosses over obviously between storytelling and applied theatre, definitely. But I think this one was your idea, Antonia.
Yeah, we co-created ideas. I think this was the starting point. I mean, when we talk about digital storytelling, we tend to think of a 5-step process, and we tend to start with what we would call a story circle, to then move in the next sessions. And actually, the following weeks are somehow an expansion and adaptation, and as let's say the applied theatre and storytelling are more interconnected, interlinked. Probably in the first week, you're right, it's more like an introduction to the process with a more conventional story circle, in which we would ask each participant to actually start framing ideas for a story they would like to develop in the following weeks. And usually in a story circle, we allow each participant, we facilitate conversations, we allow time and space for them to actually start sharing. Sometimes we use an object, sometimes we use a photograph. In this case, we don't know. It's, as we said, it's the facilitator's choice to see what is best. Sometimes we provide prompts, but I think the key question we were exploring in the beginning about how does it feel like to be a woman in India could be actually the core theme of the story circle. And each of them would be asked to share a key moment, a key experience in their daily life, as an example of what they want to share with the rest of the group. And the beauty of the story circle is actually the active role of the listeners. And there's also an opportunity to create mutual support, because the facilitator should invite each participant to ask questions, to expand, to clarify, and also to support the storyteller in thinking about the audience, who is the audience they're going to share their story with. And the primary audience is, of course, the other people in the room, but also thinking about why this story could actually create connections within the group and could somehow create messages, key messages, important messages to expand that primary audience. And therefore, what story we are going to tell, for whom, to express what. Is this story meaningful to me? Is this story meaningful to other people? And have those conversations about the relevance of that story for us as individuals, but also the importance of that story within a particular community as well. So it's a way of framing ideas, creating connections, and facilitating mutual support and mutual learning, I would say. So, and what I like to say and to see in this kind of story circle is always that the role of the facilitators, it disappears, so that we are able to create such a strong connection within the group that actually the facilitator just needs to keep an eye on time and make sure that they're all interacting and having a conversation and having enough time to share the story. Something we discussed is also that sometimes there are people who are not ready to share their story. So something to keep in mind as a facilitator is also to make sure that we do that in a way that is not stressful, and therefore that people who don't want to share their story, they don't feel ready to share a story, they're still involved in the process. So they're active listening, being an active listener is as important as being a storyteller.
We have the eggs, the ice breaking, and I was trying to think, what things are we thinking of? Because I think those ice breaking activities that lead into the story circle are important. And unless I'm wrong, I think one of them, because the ice breaking activities, the aim of these is to help create a sense of a group quickly, in a way that isn't demanding of people or puts people on the spot. And I think one of the games that we suggested, which I think you said, Selina, was called The Sun Always Shines. I think
it's called different things in different places, but that's what I've heard it called most often.
Yeah, and it's a nice game because it's basically a group of people sitting down in a circle in chairs, for instance, and then somebody says something like, I have a cat, and then everybody that has a cat has to swap chairs. And it's a way in which people begin to learn about each other, and also their similarities. And then you can move that. You can move that into I believe or I think. So you can go from being really gentle and exploring people's similarities, but you can get deeper and deeper. I believe that women should have one day a week where they where they get to rule the universe, whatever it might be. So that is quite a nice ice-breaking game that might be useful leading into a story circle.
Yeah, I think we said icebreakers are essential every week as a starting point, and they should somehow be a way of, as we said, also because we're not sure if the people who are participating each week are the same for the next week. So it's we need to recreate the group every time we meet them somehow. So we need to create that kind of connections and intimacy every time we start a new week.
Sorry, Antonia, I was just going to say that is something that we can do alongside this. We can put together a kind of document of some warm-up games, because the other thing about warm-up games is the word warm-up, ice-breaking and warm-up, it's to get the energy going a bit as well, and for people to have fun. So sometimes they can be quite silly little things, but they just kind of create a playful atmosphere. So we can put together a kind of a document that lists ideas that we have.
Yeah, absolutely. We have a wide selection of icebreakers, but again, we also had a conversation about making those icebreakers culturally relevant. So I think that the facilitators could also play around those as templates and recreate something that they believe is more appealing, interesting, relevant to the local participants. The other thing we said actually is to have food at the beginning of each week or during the day, whenever is appropriate, because sometimes conversations that happen while sharing food, they are also an important, meaningful way of connecting with each other as well. And again, I remember for the facilitators, we were saying that as top tips, of course, they should be part of the process. They're not just there to dictate what to do, but they are an integral part of the actions. And sometimes they could even start sharing their own story to make sure that they somehow, we need to show our own vulnerability to make sure that the other ones, they feel comfortable in being vulnerable in a group. And the other thing we said that we might also suggest having a second facilitator is acting more as a timekeeper, as an observer, making sure that social dynamics are, that the flow of the conversation is fluid, and making sure that they can read the body language if there is tension or happiness, and how to expand happiness and reduce tension somehow.
Yeah.
Just to pick up on that as well, I think again that with an observer, their potential role is that they can be making notes of what's being said, and again that needs to be something that is discussed, with the group about what do people expect, because again, if people are sharing things, that question of how is this being recorded,
Absolutely.
What's happening to my words, is very, very important. So that needs to be something that is understood by everybody and agreed by everybody.
Yeah. That's really important. I'm just going to go back slightly and actually use something that you just said, Antonia, about when you're doing the story circle, that the facilitator becomes almost invisible, that they're part of the process. They're not the group, the circle facilitates itself. To some extent, it's the same with the icebreakers, I would say, is that you're, as a facilitator, you're definitely suggesting things and walking across the circle and changing chairs, for example, when it affects you. And in exactly the same way, you at times in those games, you should be completely invisible. And being a timekeeper rather than anything else. And but I'd also go back to one of the other top tips we've got there about where is the one I'm looking at? Let the participants stop and think. I think the temptation is, we talk about silence being valuable just under that. I think the temptation, even in icebreakers, is to rush things along, particularly if you're new to this or you're working with a new group, is that silence sometimes feels quite threatening as a facilitator, but it's actually really useful. The more, I'm not saying leave the participants to think for like 20 minutes, but in a game like that, once it's picked up its momentum, sometimes pauses are really valuable to let people stop and think about what they want to say and what they want to play with in that space. And so in that top tips, I just wanted to highlight that taking your time and not rushing through any of these exercises is a really valuable thing to do.
Yeah, absolutely. Timekeeping is not a rigid activity, actually, and goes back to the space when we were talking about the spaces. This, always being constantly aware of the space and feeling the space, feeling the emotions, and finding the right pace for that particular group. So very often in the story cycle, we say, okay, we got 5 minutes each, and now we'll keep an eye, and then we look at our, the time is clicking, and this beautiful story, we want to stop it because the time, but it's not that the case. It's actually, and this is why, as we were saying, actually, we are all involved in the process, and we are there to listen, to empathize, to respond, expand, and allow time for, taking in the intensity of the stories as well. So for the second week, I see as a key message, there is this idea of visualizing. So where is this coming from?
I think our thinking was to move away from having to think of people needing to tell their stories personally, directly through their own voice, and being able to abstract it a little bit, just to provide another way, another resource, another approach to try and draw stories out from the group. So we were thinking, in that case, let's try using some image theatre exercises. Image theatre, this kind of work is very established kind of applied theatre practice, very Bowalian. You know, it's stuff they're readily available to look at the kind of different kind of games and exercises you may use. So it's something that's reasonably common. It's relatively simple to do. You know, like anything, it can get more and more complex and more sophisticated. So that was our thinking, to have another language, another language of gathering stories.
That's great. That actually goes back, you know, when we were talking about the conventional digital storytelling process, I would actually think of digital storytelling as a transition, as an opportunity to transition through different languages. And therefore, I see the story circle as an opportunity to share our ideas through the verbal language. And then I would move into, you know, the audio recording and video editing as a transition, you know, to a sort of performative language, and then the visual language combined in a video, with again the listening and the role of the listener, the viewer, the people are in the space as active as possible, being this, I think, a sort of exercise of co-creation as well. So just to recap, so we said first week story cycle, we always start with an icebreaker, and we provide a list of potential games and icebreakers. The prompt for the story cycle is actually the key question of the 3 weeks. That is about what does it feel like to be a woman in India. For the second week, we identified another key prompt that is about think of a story, or think of a time where you were not heard, where you were not being heard. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I see here, actually, back to the ice-breaking activity, that we identified one in particular. Can you describe it?
I can't, Andy, I think this was your one. I can't.
Well, it came about partly because of this. Yes, I agree. Yeah, it came about from our interest in cultural movements connected to the idea of yes and no's, yes and no, and how you can be saying one thing, but with your body revealing another thing.
Yeah.
And I think, unless I'm wrong, that we were going to ask a series of questions, and we thought this would be a very playful activity, and then ask the women to kind of, if they were having to kind of convey that, you know, say one thing with their words and another thing with their bodies, how they would do that. Yeah. And then to kind of, when we said scaling your gesture, I think we were going from the kind of the subtlest kind of small movement up to the kind of the largest. It was an idea that, you know, I don't think, and I've never done it. I don't know if you. So we were kind of inventing a new game.
It's a good one, though. I love it.
Yes.
Because when you get to the larger scale, you're not in. It's really useful, I think, because you're not in the reality. The reality is the yes, but the how what you're feeling inside with the larger scale body gesture can be really funny and really outrageous, because you every part of your body is screaming no, but your mouth is saying yes, okay, I'll do that. And you could really play with that. Yeah, I don't know how we as a three came up with that, but I'm gonna use it a lot, I think, because it's really useful, and it takes us really nicely into people using their bodies more, because bodies as well, images of bodies are kind of key to that week too, and it's a really gentle and playful way into that. So I think it's a good one. We should all go away and test it this week.
Yeah, and also it's about code as well, and it's about secret code. So again, it's like this kind of set of a secret language that us women, we share. We know what we mean. Yeah. And they still don't get it. Yeah. Why can't they see what we're telling them with our bodies? You know. Exactly. So again, it brings a joy and a kind of sense of sisterhood, you know, which is really useful. Again, in that sense of kind of people willing to share more when they feel stronger together, kind of thing.
Yeah, completely. And it links beautifully with the main question of that week, of think of a time when you're not being heard or when you couldn't speak. That's exactly what's happening in that exercise. So it's nice. It's lovely.
It is. And actually, week 3 is a sort of celebration of this resilience. So let's say that these 3 weeks, they are independent weeks. So if there are people who are participating just one of the 3, they will get something out of each individual week. But the ones who will be able to actually participate to the 3 weeks, they will get this sort of journey, shared journey with a sort of celebration of the resilience, both as an individual and as a group at the end. And I think, yeah, you were saying something, Andy.
Well, I was just going to say, I didn't know whether you were going to move us into week 3, but I was just going to ask Selina, if you don't mind. Sorry, Selina, because I know you've done this more than I have. If you could, briefly kind of just explain a kind of an idea of the image work, because I know we were saying this thing of moving from a negative into a positive, and that classic kind of, how we might transition.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, it's something that I can write formally as a set of instructions to be played with. They're not fixed in stone again. But so if you get people in a small group of, I don't know, 3 or 5 or 6 is probably a good number, to each think of an example of when they weren't being listened to, or when they couldn't speak, or when they felt that they weren't being heard, or they couldn't say what they wanted to share those in small groups, and then between them pick one of those examples from the group that they could all that resonates with them all, and create a tableau, a frozen image, or the equivalent of a photograph using bodies, so they can show what happened in that situation, how they felt and who they were talking to, so people physically in the equivalent of a photograph but with real people show that without speaking, and then and then show those to the rest of the group, and have the group have a whole discussion about what they recognize in each of those, what they notice about them, and how they feel about those still images, and then put them back into the same group, so that then they think about what would happen if they had been heard, or they could speak in that situation, what the reaction might be, or how they might feel having done that. So you kind of get a pre and post image, if that makes sense, which you can then be shown. And then you can ask them to, I tend to do it in three very distinct separate stages with people who aren't used to using their bodies in this sort of way, so that you're scaffolding it quite carefully. So you've got the 2 extremes, not being heard and then being heard. And then you get them to transition between the 2. So how do they physically move from the not being heard to the heard? Even though they might not be particularly realistic situations, it's thinking about the resilience of how you move from a position where, or who you might share with, rather than the person that you couldn't share with, or a whole variety of different things depending on the circumstances. But they physically move between the 2, and then you show all of those and talk about those as a whole group, and again talk about what you recognized and what you didn't recognize. And the physical body thing is usually quite funny. People will they like to make those images, and there's joy in the room when they do that, even though the topic might be quite difficult. But where the real work happens is probably in the whole group discussion of who recognized what did that feel like, what could be changed, how could things be different, and that starts to move us into stage 3, or the workshop 3, which is about resilience. I think that's what we talked about.
Yeah, absolutely. And actually, we were not explicit in saying that at the end of each of those weeks, we would see like a reflective moment for them to actually reflect on the process and what they enjoyed, what made them, I think that would be another important time to spend as a group, let's say, at the end of each week, to actually reflect on how those different activities had them frame stories or ideas, or express feelings around these key questions we are trying to explore together. And again, the third week, it's somehow inspired by one of the steps of the digital storytelling process. Very often we use storyboards, but storyboards are usually applied as a preparation to then work on the video editing. In this case, we are using a storyboarding template actually to facilitate the story listening process. So we would like participants to work in pairs. One would act as a storyteller, the other one as a story listener, but also capturing the story in a storyboarding template to then help unfold, develop, visualize the key aspects of this story that is a story to reveal the individuals and the resilience. And we have identified 4 key blocks, key pillars of these stories that they can represent visually by drawing, and also add a few keywords in the storyboarding template, starting exploring the context of that story, understanding a particular and explaining a particular challenge, and then identifying as they're working in pairs a solution, so a co-solution we call that, and that is actually a story about the future. So they might use as a conclusion of their story, as an endpoint, something that didn't happen yet, hasn't happened yet, but could happen in the future. So it's about working together to even think about something that happened that was challenging, but finding together as a group, as a pair, a solution that could be actually a good message, a key message, as a takeaway message for the other people. And then after this exercise in pairs, they would report back to the whole group, and they would all reflect on those different, let's say, scenarios that have been co-creating about a story, about that potential better future, let's say, potential solutions identified to somehow respond to challenging situations. Great. I think that was, let's say, the end of our thinking process. Is there anything else you want to add?
Just a little thing about this idea of revealing resilience and connecting it to, and what if you are being heard. I think if I remember, we were talking about that idea of how when you do talk about and explore those moments when you did feel as though you were heard, when you felt as though you did have power, because we throughout this, we were saying this is about power ultimately, and it's partly about how through sharing these stories we learn what people used, what they needed to help them be resilient, what were the resources they drew on, and therefore what can we learn about the resources that people need to enable them to have power themselves. So I think there was something around that interested me when we were talking.
Yeah, very much so. Even if they can't change the situation, how do they live within it and have a sense of power in some shape, way, or form? I think that's really important.
That's great. Thank you both. Just to summarize the key message that actually Karen brilliantly captured, I think what we've been trying to do here is to offer a template that is not a template. We don't like templates, but it's to offer some sort of inspiration to actually design something that is absolutely owned by the facilitators, the local communities. So this is just a starting point with some key questions to sort of facilitate those conversations. But actually, what we read here at the very top, providing a deeper insight to the conversation through creativity, I think is the key ambition of this type of creative exercise we've done together.